It's Reefer Madness, the podcast with Trevor and Kirk.
Kirk, we're back.
Hey, Trevor. How you doing?
I'm good. You've been up north a little while?
Yeah, I did a 3-weeker, 21 days.
Yeah, but let's give a little preview to the people. Between being up north and coming to see me, you did a little bit of stopping and seeing people for some future episodes.
Now, this is a future episode. I had a wonderful day in Winnipeg yesterday. I was explaining to Renee, our producer, just before you showed up to the studio. The obvious story is that I went to Delta 9, huge commercial cannabis growing center, football fields of cannabis. And then I had an opportunity to meet a man who is an ACMPR grower. So he grows cannabis for medicine for himself. And the dichotomy between the environments was unbelievable. It was like 1 to 10. 10 for the commercial guys, 1 for the medicinal guy. Now, and I'm not saying 1 is worse and 10 is better. Just the dichotomy was astounding. And I was saying the obvious story is, hey, Kirk went to grow ops, commercial grow up, but the story is deeper than that, Trevor. And it's about a culture and how commercialization of cannabis is. We're going to lose a culture, and it's a good or bad. Stay tuned for that episode.
Stay tuned. It'll be really good. And I think Kirk's already putting some pictures of him at grow ups up on that Instagram thing.
It's going to happen eventually. Yeah, I'm going to tease people with it, like we're teasing people with the fines and the economy stuff.
Well, the fine sort of rolls nicely into one of the two guests today. We're into taxes and addiction. So
addictions.
Or addicted to taxes.
Well, who's addicted to taxes, the government or the people?
Well, a little of both. So, Kirk, what do you think about all the fines and taxes and social responsibility fees that are coming up?
Well, what I really enjoyed about the interview, these again are both of your interviews, and listening to them afterwards. The Economist, stay tuned, people. This guy, this gentleman, Jason Childs, he comes up with some very interesting concepts about taxing pot.
Or maybe subsidizing pot.
It's subsidizing pot. Yeah, the government should subsidize pot. But the government, we talked about the federal government. There's harm reduction. Legalizing cannabis is all about harm reduction, and they're not out to make money, right? But yet we got a conservative provincial government who has said that they're not going to tax recreational pot. They're going to have fees. But what is very curious about all this is that in our Instagram account, and our Facebook account, we posted the background, a Manitoba backgrounder. As of October 17th, if you're found supplying cannabis to a young person under the age of 19, you're going to be fined $2,500. So $2,542 you're going to be fined. Now, if I supply a young person cannabis today, I'm a pusher man and I'm going to jail. But as of the 17th, you're just going to get fined, right?
So that's an improvement. But what if, say, I wanted to go for a hike in Provincial Park, Kirk? What's going to happen to me?
Well, if you go for a hike in Provincial Park, you can get fined. You go to Winnipeg Folk Festival. There's a lot of folkies out there, and now, okay, I'm going to out people. People smoke cannabis at the folk festival.
I am shocked.
No, really, Trevor. They smoke cannabis.
There's probably some tie-dye shirts and some cannabis there.
There are some hippie wannabes. There's some full-fledged hippies, like actual 67-year-old hippies. They're smoking cannabis. But you know what? In when is it? July 2019, those guys are going to get fined. Because you're going to smoke cannabis at the folk festival, you're going to be smoking in a public place, you're going to get fined.
In Birds Hill Provincial Park.
Yes, you're going to get fined. Now, smoking or vaping cannabis in a public park, provincial park, $672.
Yeah, that's not going to go real well, is it?
And yesterday, as I'm driving home from Winnipeg in my car, I'm listening to the CBC News, and in Winnipeg they have cadets, police cadets, that patrol the streets. And
traffic enforcement, that kind of stuff.
No, it's not traffic enforcement. These guys patrol the streets. They are cadet police. There's two forces. There's a cadet police and there's a private. They wear uniforms and walk around. Well, they're going to be allowed now to find cannabis. So you go to a concert now. There used to be a time back in the day when you were allowed to smoke cigarettes in concerts. You would see the odd person smoking a spliff at a concert. You don't often see people smoking spliffs at concerts anymore because you're not allowed to smoke indoors and you get caught, blah, 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 right? So I'm going to out people again. People smoke pot outside the concert venue.
Again, shocking.
No, amazing, right? But now if you're caught smoking cannabis outside a concert, you're going to be fined non-medicinal cannabis resident in $2,542. Now, Trevor, we're healthcare professionals. I'm not advocating people smoking pot. I'm not promoting pot. But what we are, I'm a realist. I'm a practical man. People smoke cannabis. People have been smoking cannabis since the 60s that I can remember. But as of October 17th, you're not going to jail anymore, right?
Good.
Yeah, that's nice.
It's legalized.
It's legalized. I'm not going to get a criminal record anymore. That's all good. But my pocketbook's going to hurt. And I predict that the first couple of years after legalization, I think the government, that's where they're going to get the windfall. They're not going to get the windfall from taxes. And I guess we should segue to the show here.
Yeah, we'll slowly move into Dr. Childs and his actual study on taxes and cannabis.
This is my rant as a healthcare professional that, and again, Trevor, I think it's going to happen to the lower social economic people. I think once again, they're going to get hit by these fees and taxes. The rich guy is going to have a lawyer somehow. He's going to get him, he'll pay some money, he'll get fined, whatever. But it's going to hurt the people that are just
can least afford it.
Yeah, and they're going to just self-medicate it. And again, people have been self-medicating for decades. I mean, I was reading articles back. Well, I'm reading articles back, and before Christ, people were smoking cannabis. But I mean, in modern day history, I mean, in the 50s, the beatniks were smoking cannabis, and cannabis is around forever, people. It's not a big thing. This legalization is not a huge thing for a big part of our community, but it's going to hurt when they start finding people for just living their life.
Interesting times.
It is. It truly is why we started this. And, I think it's important that we bring these forward, to justify where my head's at here. I promised you when we started this program, this project, our reefer Medness project, was I wanted to research this as a master's thesis and maybe a PhD thesis. So that means that we have to look at all the issues, right? And I really believe these fines that the Conservative government in Manitoba have set up, they're punitive, and I don't think it's healthy for our economy or our people. Well, maybe it's going to help our economy, but I don't think it's healthy for people to once again be paranoid if they want to take their medicine.
No, and those are good points. And actually, the whole economy thing segues nicely into, we've got an economist who's going to talk about taxes on cannabis, and he's not really for them, but he, is a smart guy with some formulas and things to tell us why less tax on cannabis is a good thing.
Introduce him. Let's do it.
Okay, Dr. Jason Childs, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, I'm an associate professor of economics here at the University of Regina, and I've been doing a lot of work on cannabis legalization and the policy structures to get it right.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. So, most of us either didn't take economics or Econ 101 was a little while ago, but not to scare everyone, this is very accessible. So, for example, my daughter, who's 16, works in a gas station, last night was having this conversation with someone. She was selling someone cigarettes, and his comment was, "Yeah, in a couple months, I'm just going to buy pot, and it's going to be great." And she said, my 16-year-old's comment was, "Well, if they don't tax it too much." And the 16-year-old had a 10-minute conversation with somebody about how much they're going to tax this. So this paper you've written is very interesting and very timely. So, but back to Econ 101. Before we get through the whole paper, let's get some terms out of the way. For those of us who don't remember, what are externalities?
So an externality is a cost that we usually think in terms of negative externalities. Let's get that clear. But it's a cost or a benefit that accrues to somebody who's not directly involved in the consumption or production of something. So with cigarette smoke, to use your example, if I'm sitting beside you smoking a great big cigar or something, I'm not the only one who's affected by that. You have to breathe the secondhand smoke.
Okay, that's great. So the other one, and I love this term, I'm going to try and say it as much as possible for the rest of the day. What's a Pigovian tax?
So a Pigovian tax or a Pigouvian tax is a tax named after Professor Pigou, a famous old dead economist. The idea is you can use a tax to get people to consume less so that we reduce the amount of an externality we have to put up with.
Okay, so one of the ones I read and sort of applies here. So sugary drinks, some places like New York City and others have decided to put in a tax on sugary drinks because they think it's going to reduce obesity and other health-related issues. Would that be a Pagovian tax?
In the New York case, only weekly because healthcare isn't really an externality in the U.S. because it's privately funded.
Okay.
Better example would be the taxes we have on alcohol right now. Those are Pagovian tax. There are negative externalities associated with the consumption of alcohol. In Canada, we carry the medical costs. There's crime costs. Somebody who's not drinking can be hit by a drunk driver. That's an externality. We put a tax on it to try and reduce the amount of alcohol consumed, to reduce the amount of those negative consequences we have to put up with.
Okay, so we know, and in Manitoba, they've actually even called one of the things they're planning on putting on recreational cannabis. They're actually called it the social responsibility tax, a 6% on the retail revenue, and they've said they want to redirect some of that towards public education, safety, health, and addictions. So that's the kind of idea. So if governments put on a tax for reducing the negative externalities of recreational cannabis and funneling that money to help reduce the negative externalities, that's kind of the idea behind it?
That's a rough idea. Again, in strict textbook definition, you don't have to do anything particularly intelligent with the revenue. You just have to increase the price to reduce consumption. But that's not a bad idea either.
Okay, but I think that rolls nicely into the next thing that governments like to do with taxes is just increase their general coffers. Mm-hmm. So let's start getting into what your paper was talking about with cannabis. So we have cannabis, we have an illicit market now, we're going to have a legal recreational market in a month or so. Mm-hmm. What should the government be looking at when they're trying to price how much tax to put on it?
Well, that's a real question, and nobody really knows the answer. And that's one of the things we try and do in this paper is explore a range of possibilities about how people are going to respond to the legal market. We don't really know, and nobody really knows what consumers are going to want to do in this environment. One of the things we can be moderately comfortable with is the idea that they're going to view cannabis purchased through the illicit market and cannabis purchased through the legal market as substitutes of some sort. They may not be perfect substitutes, but you can maybe get people to switch based on pricing. If we want to get them to switch to the legal market, we can't overprice it. Okay,
that makes sense. So, if the shady guy in the corner sells it for $5 and the government decides with all its taxes is going to be $10 a gram, obviously I'll be, unless there's a really good reason not to, I want to buy it from the shady guy in the corner.
Right, exactly, and that's the problem we're facing. And every time we levy a new tax, be it the social responsibility tax, just GST or PST, you're inflating the price of legal market cannabis and giving the illicit market more room to operate. Okay, now that another part of your paper I found really interesting is you were talking about the negative externalities from the illicit or legal market being higher than from the legal one. Right.
So, one argument would be make the taxes as high as possible. That way people will use as little legal cannabis as possible and will have the least number of bad negative externalities.
Right.
What would be but I don't think that's the way your paper was leaning.
No. The idea here is if you have two markets, one in which the externalities are really high and one in which the externalities are lower, if people are going to consume this product, where would you rather have them consume it? Where the externalities are lower. Right? So if the externalities, the bad things that go along with cannabis consumption are smaller in the legal market, we have a really strong reason to want to move people from the illicit market to the legal market. Okay? So the argument that gets made around this, and you see this all the time, is, if we increase the price enough, people won't consume. Well, there's an easy way for people to avoid that high price. That's purchased from the illicit market. So if we increase the price of legal cannabis too much, we'll push people away from the legal market and back into the illicit market where the externalities are higher, and we'll actually make ourselves worse off.
Well, that makes a lot of sense, but let's just because you spell it out in the paper a little bit, why are the externalities, the negative externalities, higher in the illicit market than they are in the legal market?
Well, there's a whole host of reasons. In the numbers we actually used, the difference is enforcement costs and the penal system, effectively, the justice system. Every time somebody gets arrested for possession of cannabis and convicted, although that doesn't happen terribly often, there's a jail sentence or a punishment attached to it, and those punishments cost money. So that whole enforcement system around trafficking and consumption, possession, all that kind of stuff costs us money right now. And that's not going to stop under the legal system. It's still, once cannabis becomes legal, if you're caught engaging in the illicit market, there's still penalties there. So the penalty system is one source of the difference in externality. The other source of the externality is who are these people and what are they doing with their revenue? Are they paying income tax? Are they paying the other taxes? Are they is it clean product? Is it safe product? Is it sold in a responsible manner? Is it sold to youth? And all on and on and on. So there are really strong reasons to believe the externalities associated with the illicit market are higher than the externalities associated with a legal market.
No, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought about the fact basically we're doing more harm if we, through our taxation system, push more people back towards the illicit market. So you really do have to be careful about the balance. So other things I hadn't thought about, and they sort of go together with this one, is relative preference between the legal and the illegal market.
Right.
All right, Trevor. So here's a question for you. In the next segment, you talk to him about customer preferences. What if a customer prefers the legal cannabis? Then we increase the taxes? Is that what he's saying?
That's what I would have thought too, but no. He's saying even if at the beginning, even if people love the Apple Store idea and love going into these big commercial places, still keep the taxes low. So let's hear him say why. So yeah, it kind of makes sense on the face of it that, I really might like, Uncle Joe's strain of cannabis. Mm-hmm. So how did you sort of take customer preference into account in your paper?
Well, nobody knows what this looks like. Let's be really clear. And there's no way to really get at the revealed preference approach to this. We can't go, what did people buy and track it and figure this out. So everybody's going to have to guess. So one of the things we do in the paper is we do a sensitivity analysis. And we start and say, let's say people really prefer illicit market cannabis. And we run that all the way up to people prefer cannabis purchased from the legal market to cannabis purchased on the illicit market 2-to-1. You'd rather buy from the legal provider than the illicit provider. And we look at this whole range of possibilities. And what happens in that environment is if people really prefer the illicit cannabis, in order to achieve a positive outcome for society, we need the legal market cannabis to be cheaper and a lot cheaper than the illicit market cannabis. As people's preference shifts towards the legal market, that discount starts to shrink, but it doesn't disappear when people are indifferent. So if you're sitting there and go, gee, I don't care where I buy my cannabis, whether I buy it from, the dealer or through this illicit mail order system or from the government store or the government license store, if I don't care, even then, because of the difference in externalities, it's better off to have the illicit price be higher than the legal price. We still want that legal market to be cheaper to get people in that door.
And I think we'll talk about this a bit more later, but is this something that could change? Probably something that could change over time. Like if the government had taxes be really low now to keep the legal price lower than the illegal price, assuming, down the road, the preference really does change towards, an Apple Store, like huge box store of cannabis that has, every strain that's ever been made for really cheap. At that point, then the government, I assume, could start thinking about increasing the taxes?
Yeah, once we've eliminated the way of avoiding the tax, then you have more power to engage in that sort of price manipulation through taxation, Pigouvian taxes. That's absolutely correct. Until the illicit market is eliminated and we can be relatively confident it's not going to crop up again, we can't engage in that kind of pricing policy if we're serious about the policy objectives that were stated in, the Legalization Act.
Okay, now, but back to minimizing their externalities, minimizing the bad things that happen when people buy recreational cannabis. Mm-hmm. Your paper had a nice little graph showing that even, because again, the argument would be just tax the snot out of it and then, we'll have zero negative externalities because people won't use it very much at all.
Right.
But that wasn't what you found. What did you find was going to be the best way to have the least amount of bad things happen?
Well, again, to minimize the externalities, we want to move people from the high externality illegal or illicit market to the lower externality legal market. So long as they've got that option to go to the high externality illicit market, we need to keep the legal price low.
No, that's very succinct. And because, maybe if they put lots of tax on the cannabis, I'm going to have to pay less income tax. When you did the analysis, how should the government think about doing this to maximize their profits?
Remarkably across all three conditions we test for, the results are the same. Essentially, there's some quantitative differences, but qualitatively, it all lines up. Again, if you want to maximize the revenue from the legal market, which governments can tax or collect themselves, then you've got to get the illicit market to lose the competition, and that means lower prices.
So, Trevor, what I'm kind of thinking is a lot of the skeptics out there are saying that the government is legalizing cannabis so they can tax it, so the government can make money off cannabis taxes, right? But I guess obviously, if the government wants to make money, they just put more taxes on cannabis.
Again, I agree with you. That makes sense. I've heard that lots too, right? Let's make money. Let's tax the snot out of it. I keep saying snot, but that's fine.
You say snot a lot.
I say snot a lot. But again, Dr. Child says no. At least at the beginning, while there's still a black market, the more you tax the legal stuff, basically the more you drive people to the black market, and then you don't get taxes at all. So again, if you want to just increase government coffers, you keep the taxes low.
Okay, let's see what he says.
So really, across all the different areas, everything that you adjusted in the formula, all the different areas you looked at, the answer for getting sort of the best bang for our buck, the least bad things, the most money for the government, was all keeping the price of the legal cannabis lower than the illicit one.
We've got to be. Let me be a little bit careful here. There are some behavioral assumptions built into that, and that we see there are ranges of preference that consumers will behave in a way that allows you to price legal cannabis much higher than illicit market cannabis. So if people really, really like going to the legal provider, then great, go ahead and price it. If they're not seen as substitutes at all, so if people see them as radically different products and aren't willing to switch back and forth, that gives the legal market room to raise prices. But if they view these goods as substitutes, or reasonably close, then, and people don't have this radically strong preference for legal market, then we've got to keep it lower. We've got to keep the price lower.
And when you and your co-author were looking at this and developing the formulas, were you looking at any other markets like, say, Colorado, where they have basically done what Canada's doing now, but are 3 or 4 years into it, about what happened with taxes and their markets?
Yeah, we watched. That informed kind of what we were doing. A lot of this work actually comes from, let me back up here. We were informed by a number of different things: Colorado, Washington, Oregon, and other jurisdictions that have gone through this sort of, in the U.S., pseudo-legalization process, because we can't really call it total legalization because it's still not legal at the federal level. And that creates some weirdness in those industry structures. But also looking at what goes on with things like alcohol and cigarettes as well. So all those things informed us. I mean, one of the things that we have to keep in mind about this, and that we haven't yet controlled for in our analysis is how is the illicit market going to respond to the entry of the legal market? And if you look at Colorado and other jurisdictions, what happened is the price fell. And we're already starting to see that in the pricing data through priceofweed.com or StatsCan's own metrics. We're seeing the price of illicit market cannabis start to fall already.
So this could conceivably lead to like a price war or a race to the bottom on the price per gram?
Yeah, I think that's entirely possible. I mean, we saw Colorado have prices fall to $4 or $5 a gram shortly after legalization, and that's one way to squeeze these illicit market providers out. Right? Is you make it not profitable, and then they leave, and then you've got more room to raise prices. So there is almost an argument here for the governments who are running this, in Quebec East, or who are running the show here, to really engage in what's called predatory pricing. So price below cost and drive the illicit market providers out, and then you can raise prices later.
All right. So isn't this kind of a socialist thing? This guy is he? You're a card-carrying conservative, aren't you? There, Trevor.
I am actual card-carrying conservative. Yes.
Yes, it's not just a phrase. You're an actual card-carrying. So he's talking about government subsidizing pot.
Yeah.
Is that going to be a good idea?
Economically, it is a fantastic idea because this is predatory pricing going in the right direction. So if we put our tax dollars, say we give our tax dollars to Delta 9.
Why don't they take the fees? Why don't they take the fees that they fine everybody?
Sure, we take the fees and we funnel it directly to someone like Delta 9. Delta 9 lowers their prices below the cost of production of the black market. The black market goes away. Economically, it makes a ton of sense. Could you that fly politically? Probably not.
Well, no, I don't think so. I mean, it might make me feel better if they're fining me for smoking my medicine, and I know that the fine's going to subsidize big cannabis. I don't know if that's going to work.
No, I think you'd get everyone on the left and the right upset at you at that point. But again, economically, it makes a lot of sense.
And from a harm reduction perspective, again, we go right back to episode 1, our first episode, and we talked about harm reduction, and the whole purpose for the federal government to do this thing was to get it out of the hands of the black market, the criminal market, and to get it out of the hands of kids. So I don't disagree with what he's saying at all.
No, and we've learned a couple new words. We've gotten through Pigovian taxes, which we'll mention lots, but negative externalities sounds like that is the economists speak for harm reduction. So.
It is, exactly. And as a nurse, we always talk about that. The whole concept of having needle exchange, the whole idea of having a safe injection sites, the whole idea of just legalizing all contraband, all drugs is all the extra analogy. It all takes costs away. It decreases the cost of healthcare. It helps people. It's the right thing to do.
It is. Now, politically viable, that's a whole other different thing. But let's get back to the economic arguments with Dr. Childs.
Sure.
So arguably, would that be the government like subsidizing a licensed producer if we're doing it below cost?
That could be. Now, legal providers licensed producers have prices, if you go through their financial reports, somewhere around $2-3 a gram at the high end.
Okay. But yeah, I'm just going through that'd be a fantastic thought experiment to have our tax dollars going to subsidize a legal producer, which everything you said makes sense. As a politician, I can't imagine trying to fly that one. I
can't see that being politically viable. It's economically optimal, perhaps, but it's definitely not politically viable.
Oh, that's fascinating. So I think we've covered most of the stuff in the paper. This has been really interesting. Yeah. And yeah, the whole, I'm just maybe a libertarian bent. I just like the whole keep taxes low, but you made some fantastic arguments for why we should.
Well, go ahead.
No, anything else that I've missed? I'm just a pharmacist here. You're the economics prof. Anything else I've missed, or that our listeners of Reefer Minutes need to understand about what the government should consider in their taxation policies?
Well, I think you hit upon the dynamic element of this wonderfully, which is really important and often gets missed. And looking back at history, we've cranked up the price of cigarettes in this country. And one of the things that happened in the 90s is we saw the market get absolutely flooded was smuggled cigarettes. Right? Why? Because the taxes were so high. So what was happening was people were buying them in the U.S. and then smuggling them back into Canada and selling them illegally. And when we ended prohibition on alcohol, it took us a very long time, decades in fact, to deal with the illicit market, and we kept prices relatively low and enforcement relatively high in order to squeeze out the illicit market in alcohol. So we've done this before. And you picked up on this wonderfully, that the game will change as the illicit market gets eliminated.
Well, that was fantastic. I again, thank you very much for your time. We really enjoyed geeking out on some Economics 101. My co-host is just scribbling down a question. Kirk, you want to just jump on the mic? We're just going to switch mics
sure,
here.
Tag team
just
is
go
fine.
ahead and ask him about health. What I'm interested in is, has he built in externalities into the listed market and the repercussions of health factors with cannabis?
So just some more clarification on the externalities. When you were looking at the negative externalities on the legal side, did you take into account health costs? They're debate exactly what they are, but like mental health and physical health costs into those externalities?
So we didn't construct that externality ourselves. That's taken from another paper. I can't remember the authors off the top of my head. I apologize for that. But they estimated the costs to cannabis, and that included healthcare and mental health and all that kind of estimate, including lost productivity as well.
Okay, and
so it's in there. Is it in there in the way that it really should be? That's a hard question to answer.
Okay, but it was in there, and I assume we're assuming that the health-related costs would be similar in the legal and illegal markets.
We're maintaining the assumption that they'll be identical.
Okay.
Because we don't have any reason at this point in time to say that they'll be different. It's possible that the legal market cannabis health costs and mental health costs could ultimately end up being lower as strains are outlawed, right? So if you find strain XYZ has really nasty mental health outcomes for youth, you just say, look, we're not selling that strain anywhere. Anybody caught with that strain is in big trouble. So you could conceptually do that. So there's an argument to suggest that maybe the externality would be even lower than that, but we wanted to not completely load the deck.
No, that's great. So this has been fascinating. We really appreciate your time. And any last words for our listeners before we let you get back on to thinking big thoughts about microeconomics?
Oh,
no, thank you guys very much, and don't be afraid to reach out again.
Reefer Madness, the podcast.
All right, Trevor. So another interview. You've been a busy boy. It makes me feel bad.
Well, you've been up north, and the phone lines aren't wonderful up there.
So, all right. So we're going into addictions now. This is more now healthcare focused. I enjoyed this interview. I enjoy all our interviews. You listen to our podcast, and you and I always repeat the same phrases.
Yeah, that was a good one.
That was a good one. I agree with you. Yes, but no, another one. I find this interview. It's again, Trevor. We said we were going to interview bright people, and I always find bright people tend to be very calm and they're very secure in their knowledge, and they don't need to go and push it down your throat. This gentleman that you're interviewing, Dr. Stea, I really enjoyed how he looks at addiction. And in my world, in my personal life, I have had friends that have had issues with cannabis, dear friends. I think I mentioned him. I didn't out him, but I think I mentioned him in one of our earlier episodes, how went to high school, junior high school, elementary school with this gentleman, and watched him in our teen years get into cannabis, and in our 20s and 30s and now our 50s, and how he truly does have an addiction with cannabis. And he's actually, I've talked to him since, he's getting help right now, and he's actually quite prepared eventually to talk to us about his addiction to cannabis. And he falls into many of the things Dr. Stea speaks about.
Yeah, and some of the things I liked about Dr. Stea, we mentioned the word nuance a lot, but it was nuance. Both cannabis addiction is going to be worse than we think, because not that cannabis is particularly addictive, but after legalization, there will be just so many more people using it, more than likely, that there's going to be more problems with addiction. But it's also going to be better than we think, because it's not that addictive. You know, we talk about everything from it's probably less addictive than alcohol and nicotine, which are common right now, to the fact that it's not, an overdose of it isn't going to kill you. You know, you have an opioid addiction. Well, everyone around you probably should be constantly worried that you're going to die one day. Cannabis addiction, not that I'm not minimizing someone with cannabis addiction, but you're not are very unlikely to die of a cannabis overdose. So yeah, interesting with the same interview, I came away, wow, that's addiction stuff sounds worse than I thought. And wow, that doesn't sound as bad as I thought. So he was really interesting.
We're going to squirrel here a little bit before we get to him. The green market, the gray market, the cannabis, culture. I've been through this podcast and just through my upbringing and stuff. I know people in this culture, and I don't think it's a surprise to anybody if they've listened that I kind of have a finger in this culture. And what a lot of them are really quite concerned about is that everyone. The common concerns, we call them the common concerns. The common concerns, a lot of it's built on stigma, lack of understanding. And now, the last year and a half, 2 years since Liberals have announced that we followed this process, and again, why we started this podcast, now everyone's focused on cannabis and, oh my God, cannabis, they're going to legalize and, the demons are going to come, the moon's going to turn black, the shadows are going to take over us. People...
That was very poetic.
I'll catch that later. And but cannabis. First of all, we know from the scientists that cannabis there's no receptors in the brainstem in the cardiac center, the respiratory.
You're not going to stop breathing. Your heart's not going to stop.
There is no known death from cannabis. Now, people have died.
Doing stupid things.
But that's the Darwinian theory, right? Darwinian theory was just thinning out the population. Stupid people will always be stupid people.
No. It's healthcare professionals.
No.
We can't demonize the stupid because you and I fall into that every so often as well.
I'm not trying to demonize the stupid people, but don't drive high, people. Right now, people that take their medicine, that are taking medicine. We have to determine if you're competent to drive, and that's a different podcast, right? We have a fellow in the wings that'll talk to us about that. But if you're going to do,
no stigma, and it comes back to the stigma, and the sky is, like you said earlier, the sky is not going to fall. Cannabis addiction is not going to be the end of the world, but and I really like what we got. Like you said, talk to smart people who can give us some of the nuance behind that, because. The general headlines you get out there right now in the newspapers are not nuanced.
No, and I did a little preparation for this interview because, the whole DMS, what is DMS-5? The
Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. That's the big Bible of sort of mental health disorders.
Yes, they've got marijuana use disorder in there, Dr. Daya gets into this, but essentially. I think what I liked about his interview is that we talk about cannabis because this is a podcast about cannabis, but addiction is addiction. If you are addicted to anything that affects your day to day, that there's an inability for you to perform your tasks of your day. If you're sitting in your parents' basement at 30 years old playing games and high all the time. And you don't have a job, and your mom still does your socks and sorts your socks, you might have a cannabis problem, right? But you might also have other problems. You might also have an alcohol problem. You might also have just a social disorder problem, right? But getting back to the addictions, let's introduce this guy. Get me off my soapbox. Let's talk to the
Okay, so we have Dr. Jonathan Stea from Calgary. And Dr. Stea, can you introduce yourself to us?
Yeah, I'm Jonathan Stea. I'm a clinical psychologist. I provide assessment, treatment, and consultation services to individuals with mental health disorders and addictive disorders.
Thank you very much. And you've written some interesting things on addiction in general and cannabis in particular. So we're really excited that you agreed to chat to us today. So before we delve deep into some of the papers and things you've written, so help us out. Can you give us kind of a working definition of what's addiction?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll go with the way that it's currently thought of in what's called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. That's basically the text that's used by medical professionals and psychiatrists to diagnose mental health disorders and addiction and addictive disorders. And in there's basically biological symptoms of addiction, like withdrawal and tolerance. There's psychological symptoms of addiction, like unsuccessful attempts to control your use, even though you want to cut down. You're not able to do that. It's worsening. Using a substance and it's actually worsening other psychological problems like depression or anxiety. There's also social related symptoms with respect to addiction. So that means that because of the substance use, you're not able to it's interfering in your life in a number of ways. So it could be interfering with the relationships in your life, responsibilities that you have at home or at work or at school. So those are sort of the things we kind of call that that's thinking about addiction in terms of a biopsychosocial model. So addiction can have bio symptoms like biology, psychological, and social symptoms.
Okay, thank you. That's really good. And I'll be jumping all over the place, but I really liked one of your papers I read where you were comparing treatment models for cannabis addiction. So you were comparing, if I've got all my facts straight, sort of someone who went off cold turkey, someone who went sort of through a treatment program where they went through moderation, which I assume we sort of slowly decreased how much cannabis they're using, and then something else called a natural quitting point, if I'm getting all my terminology straight. Was that sort of what you were looking at in this recent paper where you're the author?
Yeah, that was some of my doctoral dissertation work. We basically had, and then we published from that. We had people come to the lab that at one point they had a cannabis addiction or a cannabis use disorder, and then they recovered from that addiction or disorder, and we wanted to explore how they did that, and we looked at various subgroups. So some people were able to no longer meet addiction criteria, and they don't smoke or they don't use cannabis at all. So we compared that group. And we also compared people that once had a cannabis addiction and they no longer meet criteria, but they still use once in a while. And we called that kind of our moderation group. So that was kind of, those were a subset. And then we also compared another subset of groups where people that had a cannabis addiction recovered with the help of treatment, and then people that recovered on their own without the use of any treatment. Basically what we found, there's lots of findings. In a nutshell, though, we found that you can think of cannabis addiction on a continuum of problem severity. So someone can have a more or less severe cannabis addiction. That's also reflected in the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. And what we found is that the people that tended to have a more severe cannabis addiction, those folks tended to need a recovery trajectory or a recovery path that was abstinence-based, so they no longer use anymore. And those people more often sought treatment for their difficulties. And so that's as opposed to people that had sort of a milder form of cannabis addiction. Those people were able to recover and still use once in a while. And on average, those people also were able to recover without the aid of treatment. So those are the averages, and that's kind of what it looked like on a dimensional kind of spectrum.
Well, and that's really interesting. And I'm glad that I'm talking to somebody who explored some of the nuances. As a pharmacist, I talk to people trying to quit smoking all the time. And, that's what I say in my sort of general practice now is, the people who for whom quitting smoking was easy have already done it because, with all the social stigma and the taxes and, most people, almost any job site now, it's very hard to smoke at work. So it's, just very difficult to be a cigarette smoker in Canada today. So people who were smoking half a pack a day or smoking socially on weekends when they had a beer have probably quit already. It's the people who have, and I guess I didn't have the right clinical definition, but a more severe addiction are the ones who are still coming to the pharmacy sort of looking for prescription aids to help them quit. So it sounds like that's kind of what you found in cannabis addiction as well.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And your point is well made, because the same kind of principle applies to other addiction areas too. Just like, alcohol is sort of, the alcohol literature looked at this stuff before the cannabis literature, and they found similar findings.
Oh.
So there's a whole research literature on something called controlled drinking and moderated drinking. So people that can control their alcohol use, so to speak, even though they've had an addiction, versus people that had a more severe alcohol use disorder, and the findings are kind of the same. It tends to say that the people that needed treatment had a more severe alcohol addiction, and so the cannabis findings are similar to that.
Oh, thank you. That's really good.
Which makes intuitive sense. Right?
It really does, and sort of goes against this kind of all or nothing thinking that often comes when people start talking about cannabis, which is, like everything else, the real answer is probably a little more nuanced.
Exactly. And, I would even broaden that to addiction, because people can get into debates about addiction and whether you need treatment and whether you need complete abstinence or not. And so it even extends beyond cannabis into different models, like things like 12-step programs in AA. They're really great and they can be helpful for a lot of people, but they take a very abstinence-based approach to treatment. So they don't really take into consideration the problem severity, versus other sort of treatment models might take into account the severity and maybe look at it in a bit more nuanced way. And, those are some of the harm reduction approaches.
Oh, thank you. So we've sort of got onto cannabis addiction. So tell us, so what does the literature say about what rate, does it have, about how often do people get addicted to cannabis? If you took 100 casual cannabis users out there, what does the literature say about how many should end up with sort of an addiction or dependence problem?
Right. So there's been a lot of large-scale surveys that have tried to look at this over the years. The best estimate that we have is about 1 in 10 people, that ever try cannabis at least once. They are likely to they can meet diagnostic criteria for cannabis addiction. So it's about 1 in 10 people that ever try it. That said, the rates, and that rate is actually lower compared to some of the other substances like alcohol and nicotine and cocaine.
So Kirk, what we're coming into next is how addictive cannabis is. We've talked about the 1 in 9. We're going to stay with that for the moment. But there is evidence, and Dr. Stay is going to get to it, about that alcohol and nicotine are more addictive than cannabis. Any thoughts or short rants on?
No, I think
alcohol versus.
Well, I ranted I think I got it myself. I loosened myself up in the beginning there. No, I think Dr. Stay has been. I think he's approaching this very well. I think our culture is very aware of the alcohol addictions. A big part of that is the cage questions, 5 cage questions I ask in when I'm determining people's alcohol issues. And but no, I like the way he goes into it, and I think he explains it well. So let's listen.
So it's about 1 in 10 people that ever try cannabis will meet addiction criteria. That rate, though, actually changes depending on some factors. So age is one of them, and we know that it's about 1 in 6 or 1 in 7 among youth or adolescents. If they try it quite young, then they're a little more increased risk of developing a cannabis addiction. And the other important variable is frequency of use. So the research suggests that people that use daily or near daily cannabis use, they're substantially more likely than that 1 in 10 criteria to meet cannabis addiction criteria.
And intuitively, that makes sense, right? I think most of us will have that friend or relative who, most of us will have alcohol on, say, weekends at a social function, but most of us have that friend, relative, acquaintance who, seems to be having that drink every day, or those 6 drinks every day, and
That's right.
It kind of makes sense that those would be the people who, if they were told for a medical reason that they had to stop drinking or reduce their drinking, are going to have more problems. So that sort of follows the same with cannabis.
Yeah, I would agree. So the more frequently someone uses a substance, the higher risk they are to become addicted to it. That's intuitive.
And I'm glad you mentioned some of the other substances. Now, I know everyone's got their own numbers, but the ones I pulled up from a StatsCan survey was talking about 91% of people in Canada have tried alcohol, and they're quoting 18% for dependent and tobacco. About 44% of people of Canada have tried it, and about 16% have had a dependence issue. So, and I'm not trying to minimize people who have a cannabis use disorder, but it does seem like it's less prevalent than some of our other very commonly used, we'll call them recreational substances out there. Is that fair?
Yeah, I would say it's fair compared to alcohol and tobacco. And the thing is, some of the illicit substances, you can call them, you might say they have a more addictive potential. So something like heroin or cocaine. And so, the thing with cannabis, though, so cannabis would have a less addictive potential, but cannabis is also more widely used. So we're more likely to see those people in treatment programs. So even though the addiction might be less severe and less likely to happen to a random person, the fact that it's so widely used, it inflates that number so that you kind of, does that make sense?
Yeah, no, and I think that's very relevant at the moment because, in less than a month now, we're going to have legal cannabis. So you would assume that would make the number of people using it across Canada go up. So, that you would think that even though the percentage is relatively low, the absolute number of people who have a cannabis use disorder is going to go up as well.
That's exactly right.
So a part of his argument I thought was really interesting, and you had to be a little careful of the nuance, was that so cannabis is less addictive than some of our other, we'll call them quote unquote hard drugs, our fentanyl, our heroin, our cocaine. But especially after legalization, there's going to be more people trying it. So the absolute number of addicted cannabis people is going to go up, and that could be a problem.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, obviously what's going to happen is, and we know this from literature, that more people are going to try it. And I think education is going to be important. But one thing that troubles me about, again, the stigma of the cannabis legalization is that there are certain things that we do know. We know that Canada, the Western world, the States, we're all wrestling with opioid addictions.
Yeah, no, that's fair.
Right. And we're all wrestling with I mean, in my practice, we have Narcan kits. And I mean, I can't tell you how many times I have injected people with Narcan. And one thing, if people don't understand, Narcan is, well, you're the pharmacist. You just explain, what is Narcan?
So Narcan is an opioid reversal agent. So you jam that into somebody, and it should bump the opioid off the opioid receptor and reverse the overdose. So, actually might start someone breathing again.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't see it as a reversal. I see Narcan as actually it's actually its own narcotic. And you're right. It bumps off the bad narcotic, the opioid, off the receptor. And yes, people will wake up, bam, they're awake and become combative. So sometimes we as nurses say, okay, we've just diagnosed that this guy is an opiate overdose. Let's put him back. And about 5 minutes later, he'll go back and he'll be calm. And now we know what's going on. So sometimes we do it so that people don't die from opiate overdose, but we also do it as a diagnostic. We don't have to worry about that with cannabis, man. We don't have to worry about that with cannabis because people don't die from cannabis. It's not in the brain stem. So yeah, do we have anything to worry about? What does Dr. Stea say?
Let's go to Dr. Stea.
Yeah.
It's Reefer Madness.
Is it fair to say there's sort of a levels of addiction? Like, as a pharmacist, when I think about things like overdoses, it's pretty easy for me to say a overdose on an opioid is worse because, it stops you from breathing and you have a good chance of dying, where a overdose of cannabis is unpleasant, and you might end up having to be sort of monitored for 24 hours depending on what happened, but very unlikely to actually die. Is it fair to say things like opioid addiction is more quote unquote severe than a cannabis addiction, or is just not fair comparing the two of them?
I absolutely think it's fair. I mean, if I'm treating a patient and I'm given a choice, if that patient has an opioid addiction or a cannabis, I'd rather them have a cannabis addiction because I'm less worried that they are going to overdose and die, and that they're using heroin laced with fentanyl and whatnot. So, I think you can think of, you can't really compare the symptoms of addiction because symptoms of addiction are similar, but you can rank order the harms associated with the use. And again, it's not to trivialize the cannabis addiction because for that person going through it, those are very real harms. I mean, if someone has a cannabis addiction and their relationships are being ruined and they're not doing well at work and they can't get out of the house because they're smoking all day, every day, and they have anxiety and they don't want to leave the home. I mean, those are real difficulties for someone, and it's worth improving their life and addressing the addiction. That said, compared to someone with a fentanyl addiction or an opioid addiction, I'm really scared about that because, as you said, they can overdose and die, and I don't have that concern with cannabis.
No, thank you. Flipping through my notes here because you wrote so many interesting things. Maybe not truly addiction anymore, but just a myth that I want to ask about, because honestly, I was a full-fledged believer in this one. Addictive personality. So it's something I saw you write said there's really the whole idea of an addictive personality not really a thing. So I'll use an example that I like quoting. So a professional person I know wholeheartedly says he's got an addictive personality. Everything he does, he just sort of does it to the nth degree, got into martial arts, and that's all he would do for, 5-6 days a week. And then he went and decided he really liked golf. So, goes down to Florida, spends a month there getting lessons, and then that's all he does. And, he's a previous smoker and it seems like everything he does, he just does until he can't do it anymore. And he calls himself an addictive personality, and I would tend to agree. So that's not really a thing.
Well, I know it's a colloquial term that's often used, but if and to be honest, when I was studying this stuff, throughout my grad school, like that was something I was interested in looking at too. And the research just really doesn't bear it out in terms of the personality models that we have. So the ways that we understand things like personality traits, and, there's no addictive personality in the DSM-5. There's things like borderline personality disorder and obsessive compulsive personality disorder. There is no addictive personality disorder in the research literature. There's different models. There's different ways of thinking about personality. That one, it doesn't come up. That said, there are certain risk factors that can predispose someone to having an addiction. So, these are complicated areas of research. So I'm going to make kind of global statements, but someone can be there's in some models of personality, there's something called sensation seeking, where someone likes to seek out like sensations and adrenaline rushes and things like that. And if someone's more likely to do that, then they may have more of a propensity for an addiction. But we don't know how does that manifest in a particular kind of addiction. So to someone with sensation seeking, are they more likely to have a cocaine addiction versus, say, a cannabis addiction, where there's maybe a different quality of thrill involved? And so there's certain risk factors that we can kind of pinpoint, and there's genetic predispositions. So if addictions kind of runs in families, and there's a whole bunch of genes that can be connected to it, then that can predispose to someone developing an addiction. But in terms of an actual addictive personality construct, so a whole bunch of things that lump together that kind of make you more likely to get an addiction, that just hasn't borne out. So I agree with you that it's somewhat counterintuitive, but when you look at the science, it's just not there.
No,
the research hasn't supported it.
No, our intuitions often lead us astray. So no, that I found that very interesting. You did touch on genetics because, that also comes up, my grandfather was an alcoholic. My father was an alcoholic, so my sister and I don't have a chance. Because addiction is so complicated and multifactorial, do we have any idea sort of how strong that genetic link is, or, is it, my father's an alcoholic, I now have a risk of being a cannabis addict, or what do we know about genetics and addiction, or is that just a thing we need the researchers to do a little more work on?
It's still an area of ongoing research. I mean, I've read some estimates where they'd say it's about 50% to 70% heritable, based on things like twin studies. And I'm not an expert in that area, but I've read some of it. And there's another area of research called, there's an area of genetic research called genome-wide association tests. And those things, they try to look at particular genes and try to pin those down to see if they're associated with something like a cannabis use disorder. And that my understanding is that area of research is really new, and that there's no particular gene that can pin anything down. It's usually clusters of genes, and the clusters of genes usually predict things like addiction per se, and not necessarily cannabis addiction or alcohol addiction, or they may. So it's hard to kind of make clarifications on these things, but we do know that with addiction per se and with mental health disorders, it's always we know that there's genetic contributions there, and we also know that there's environmental contributions. So the way that you're raised and what you've learned throughout your life, and those things interact with your genes. So even if someone is predisposed to say something like an alcohol use disorder or a cannabis use disorder, that doesn't mean that they'll develop it based on a number of things. Maybe they're able to cope with emotions, and maybe they don't want to use cannabis for a number of reasons, or maybe they just engage in different activities. So there's things that you can do to protect yourself, even if you have a genetic predisposition to developing a mental health or addiction disorder. So which is a very fascinating and kind of new area of research. And if people are interested, one of the terms for that is something called epigenetics, and that's sort of how the environment influences genetic and gene expression.
Oh, yeah, no, the whole field of epigenetics is fascinating, and unfortunately, we have limited time. So before I let you go, just another sort of rabbit hole to go down, because
Sure.
We've talked previously on this podcast, and it definitely comes up in reading, is one of the potential downsides of cannabis is in people with mental health issues, and whether or not cannabis causes or makes worse or triggers things like depression and anxiety. But I was reading you making a sort of passing reference to there might be some thought about cannabis being able to be used to treat things like PTSD, anxiety, and depression. Is that a thing, or something that people are kind of looking at? How might that work?
Yeah, that's one of my favorite rabbit holes. It's a fascinating area, actually. It's a very, very complex and new area. We know that cannabis users with mental health disorders are about twice as likely as cannabis users without mental health disorders to have or develop a cannabis addiction. So that's really important, because that means that one of the most vulnerable populations to developing a cannabis addiction are people that experience mental health disorders. And when we talk about cannabis, it's really important to think about cannabis as sort of an umbrella term. Like, it's such a complex substance that there's you have your CBD and you have your THC, and they interact in certain ways, and they have in many ways very different effects. And so when you think of something like cannabis used to treat anxiety, we know that cannabis in low doses might THC in low doses might have an anxiolytic effect, so be sort of anti-anxiety. But in higher doses, people can have adverse effects and have a lot of anxiety. And we know that CBD is sort of it's thought of as to be anxiolytic. So it's important to keep these things in mind. So whether someone's using the whole cannabis plant or whether they're using just pure THC or pure CBD, and there's a fascinating review paper for your listeners if they ever want access to it. It's by Jacob Borodovsky and Alan Budney. It's a new article called Cannabis Regulatory Science. It's in the International Review of Psychiatry, and they review this whole area about the interaction between cannabis and mental health disorders. And basically, the findings are mixed. So when you think of depression, when you think of anxiety, and when you think of PTSD, some research shows that it can help, and some research shows that it actually does more harm. And the majority of it right now says that it actually does more harm. But that's not to say that in the future there can't be cannabinoid-related medicines that are developed that can actually be used, and probably more CBD-related medicines that can be used in the treatment of these disorders. An important point that they make is, and that I've tried to make, is we don't want to conflate the reinforcing properties of cannabis with therapeutic potential. So what that means is just because cannabis can give you some euphoria, so it can be positively reinforcing, and it can also be negatively reinforcing, which means it takes away anxiety in the moment, and maybe it can take away some depressive feelings in the moment. We don't want to say that actually means that the disorder itself, if someone has an anxiety disorder or a depressive disorder, is being treated, because in some ways that can actually make the disorder worse, because what it does is it robs that person of the opportunity to practice healthy coping skills. So you can imagine that if you're depressed or anxious, and you're feeling anxious maybe 7 out of 10 or higher, and you instead of processing it and talking with a friend and confronting the anxiety, you just kind of escape via cannabis use, or any addiction related substance for that matter. You don't get the chance to practice the therapy skills that are required in order to overcome that anxiety disorder or that depressive disorder. And so we think that's why many people with depression and anxiety are drawn to cannabis, because it can be rewarding in the moment, but it can actually end up harming them in the long run, because it can exacerbate or make worse that mental health disorder. So in sum, it's a very complicated relationship between cannabis and mental health disorders, and I think it's fascinating. I think it has a lot of promise, but we need to be nuanced in the way that we talk about it, and we need to be very realistic. And THC might not be the best for particular populations, but maybe CBD can be very helpful, or some combination. And I'm hoping that with legalization that there's a lot of research funding into these areas, because I think it holds a lot of promise. And we also want to be able to help people that develop cannabis addiction. So that's a fun rabbit hole. No,
that was great. I will definitely look up that review paper, and we'll put a link up to it in the show notes of this one. No, that was all really good, and we're getting close to the end of your time. Thank you. You've been very generous. So for our listeners, have I missed anything? You've thought and wrote a lot about cannabis addiction use and cannabis in general. Anything else that I've missed or you want the listeners to know about?
No, I think you nailed it. It was great questions. And I think I would just probably end by saying that, I think it's important not to, I've been trying to dispel the narrative that pot isn't addicting and that it's either one way or the other. I think it's important to, this whole nuanced way of looking at it's important, and having a humble attitude towards cannabis. It's a very interesting and complex substance, and it can be very harmful, and it can also be very helpful. And so I think the best way moving forward is to acknowledge both of those things when trying to discuss it with people, because if you take an all or nothing kind of side to it, you kind of cheapen the reality of it and distort the reality, and it loses its significance.
So Kirk, I want to thank Dr. Stay again for his time and all the great points he came up, how just because cannabis makes me feel more calm doesn't necessarily make it a good treatment for anxiety, and theoretically may even make anxiety worse because maybe I'm not dealing with it. But on the other hand, they're using cannabis possibly to treat depression. Like there was lots and lots of little nuances in there that were fascinating, and maybe we're going to have to do another few episodes.
It was a very balanced approach to addiction. I deal with addictions in my practice. I see addictive people, and I thought it was interesting. You talked about there's no such thing as addictive personalities.
Yeah, that kind of floored me.
That's counterintuitive, right?
That is definitely counterintuitive because again, I'm not a psychologist,
No.
But yeah, I use that term in my day-to-day life a lot, and he says, no, that's not really a thing.
My takeaway, and thank you for letting me rant a little bit, but my takeaway of this interview was that people will be addicted to cannabis. We as healthcare professionals have to recognize that addiction. And what I'm really comforted by is I know the addiction there's not a lot of people compared to other substances, and their health is going to be more their social health, their how they relate to people, how they do their job. It's more social health than physical health when it comes to that's my takeaway.
No, I agree. You're going to be uncomfortable, mentally, psychologically, and even physically if you've got an addiction to cannabis. But unlike, say, again, we keep going back to, unlike, say, an opioid addiction where we worry about you dying. So you don't want to say it's less severe, but how about less to worry about?
God, can we say less to worry about? I guess, harm reduction, and you use the pillars of healthcare, right? And from this perspective, cannabis is still... It's not benign, but when it comes on that scale, it's not going to harm people that
as much.
Yeah.
I think we can agree with that.
Okay.
Kurt, do we have some music for this one?
We have some more local music. Now, one other thing about this, I was listening to Trevor Gordon. We played Trevor Gordon in one of our episodes just recently.
Yep.
Trevor is now living in Flin Flon, and I was listening to a podcast from Flin Flon that Trevor was in. Trevor made a comment about his hometown, Dauphin. He made a comment how there's not a musical scene in Dauphin.
Come visit, Trevor.
He hasn't been. Yeah.
It's good here.
It's good. And you know what? There is enough music in Dauphin that we've had 13, 14 episodes. We haven't repeated anybody yet. And today we're going to not repeat anybody. We're going to play a little bit of heavy metal music, a band called 10 Stone. If you're in your car, you want to crank these ones up. This is good, solid rock and roll. The song we're going to play is Long Gone, 10 Stone. Turn it up loud. Turn it to 11.
Up to 11.
Up to 11. Cheers.
See everyone next time.
Yep.
Well, time to blow this joint. Like the show? Let us know. We're Reefer Madness on Instagram and Facebook, at Reefer Madness on Twitter, or head over to the website at reefermed.ca to find out what we're all about and what's coming up next.
We up and then we down, flying high to crash to the ground. Resurrection from the dead. Your words are ringing in my head. Well, you caught me by surprise. Now the truth cuts me like a knife. Well, we gave it what we had, but it all went bad. Yeah, it all went bad. Oh, we're really long gone. Happy summer, so right, be so wrong.
This intro is going a little long, but I do want to rant. I do want to rant because this has been such a learning experience. I've done so much reading on cannabis since we started this project. And one of the things that I'm really getting frustrated about the healthcare industry that I'm part of, that you're part of.
Absolutely.
And I think we're good professionals. I mean, I'm not, I think I'm.
I have a tie on. That makes me good.
Yeah, well, you also wear a white jacket, man, and you're card-carrying conservative. I don't wear ties anymore. I don't have my diplomas on walls anymore. I'm a little bit more liberal in some of my thinking. I think universities should be free, but I digress. My point is that our profession is so ready, nursing profession, my profession, is so ready to say we do not have enough high-quality blind placebo studies that say cannabis is a good thing. Right? They're so ready to say that. We were told that when I first started this, Kirk, don't promote cannabis because we don't have enough studies.
Mine too. I heard it lots.
But we seem to know enough to say cannabis is going to be bad and we have to worry about it. We seem to have enough studies on the bad things about cannabis. Where did those studies come from?
Well, I think the argument for that would be, what do they call it? The preponderance of caution. So
the preponderance of caution.
Yeah. So precautionary principle, if you don't really know if something's going to be good or bad, assume it's going to be bad until you know something else.
So is that our intuition then? We know that smoking cigarettes is bad for you. So therefore smoking cannabis must be bad for you too.
Until proved otherwise, yes. Now, I'm not saying I know you have strong feelings about that, but that's kind of the argument.
Well, and I guess as I'm doing my research, I'm trying to see both sides of the page, and often when I listen back on some of our episodes, and Renee pieces and parses them all together and makes us sound like we know what we're doing. I see myself arguing both sides of the argument sometimes in the same show because I see that.